Um, Thanks for coming out. I am actually what I consider to be an accidental author, not an author by trade or by training. I'm actually a management consultant, and I write memos, not memoirs. Mm-hmm. So the book I wrote actually wrote itself, and the whole writing process is something that we may talk a little bit about later on, and I'd be happy to answer your questions about the process, both writing and publishing. But let me tell you a little bit about it to get us started. The book that I wrote began writing itself on October 26th, 2009, which was 2.5 months after my 74-year-old mother passed away. And within less than 2 months, within less than 2 months, I had written a 60,000 word manuscript. And so on December 17th, I took it to Staples, because having lived with it a while, I actually thought it wasn't bad. But I particularly wanted to give it to my father for Christmas. It was his first Christmas without his sweetie pie of 52 years. And so I went to Staples, I made a nice cover with a hummingbird on it, which was meaningful for us, and gave it to my father for Christmas. And with the clarity of hindsight, it's very clear to me now that the writing process for me was a healing process. It was a cathartic release of grief that just needed an outlet. And it certainly healed my heart as I was in the process of writing about my mother and our journey through terminal illness together. And it pleases me immensely that it's proving to be helpful to people who are encountering their own challenges on life's journey and facing loss. I think my mother would be particularly pleased and proud that the book that her death gave birth to has won some awards. And she would certainly be surprised that she, through her example, is inspiring so many people. I think she would be pleased that the book keeps her very present in my life, and also in my father's particularly, which is a gift that I didn't know I would receive when I was writing it, but I'm ever so thankful for the fact that every time I talk about her, every time I put up a picture of her, anytime I answer an email about her, she's so present with me, and that means a lot. And those of you who have experienced loss know what I'm talking about. So the story began, not the writing of it, but the experiencing of it began a year before I started writing, pretty much. It started on September 8th, 2008, when at the end of a long day, my phone rang. It was my dad on the line, and he asked me if I was sitting down. And that's never a good thing to hear. And I sat down at that point, trying to wonder what in the world he was going to tell me. And what he told me was that my 73-year-old mother, who was also my best friend, had been diagnosed that day with terminal lung cancer. She'd been having ocular problems that were very mysterious and hard to diagnose. And finally, a physician said, let's just do an MRI of the brain to rule anything out. And what they found were 4 tumors that they deemed rather quickly to be metastatic from lung cancer. That was the primary cancer. So I was very glad to be sitting down when that news was delivered, because it shook the earth beneath me. And if any of you have experienced terminal illness in your family or in your life, you probably will know what I mean when I say that I went straight to grief. I mean, that news hit me and I went right to grief. I went to that moment where I was without my mother, my dad was a widower, struggling to figure out how to turn the stove on. It's called anticipatory grief, which I've learned subsequently, but that's where I went directly. And it was not a good place to be. And thankfully, what happened within 48 hours of that call from my father and my premature grieving was an epiphany. I mean, that's what I call it. I woke up in the night with a thought. And just to set the stage, I'll read you a couple of pages from the book that talk about that epiphany. I should also say that after getting the news, the next day I went to a bookstore. You know, we need answers, don't we? When something inexplicable and challenging hits us out of the blue, we need to know how to deal with it. And I certainly had no clue, and I figured somebody had written the definitive book, and there is no such definitive book. I ended up buying a book of poetry, which I highly recommend. It's an anthology edited by Garrison Keillor called Good Poems. And I bought it as a gift for my mother. I didn't find an answer for me, but I found a gift for her. She loved poetry. And it was a book that actually meant a lot to us during our last year together, and that meant a huge amount to me after she died. The poems really spoke to me, and in fact, there are many poems in the book. I had to chase down the publication rights, including the estate of Edna St. Vincent Millay, because I really wanted to include that poem. Anyway, poetry was really powerful, and if you're looking for a good anthology, good poems by Garrison Keillor. But this is a little bit about the epiphany that hit me. In reacting to the news of Mom's cancer, I've been focusing in a reflexive way on what it means in the end. Her death, Dad's being a widower, our losing our mother, memories that will never be because she won't be here, things that she has perhaps already done or experienced for the last time. And I should just digress for a moment to say that I'm actually reading from an email that I sent to my siblings. I'm one of 4 children. I'm the oldest. I have a brother, Eric, and twin sisters, Claudia and Paula. And I tend to process by writing. I just put my thoughts down to make sense of them. And so after this epiphany, I woke up in the morning and sent an email to my siblings. And there are many emails in the book, in addition to poems, because as I was constructing the story and trying to relive it and retell it, it occurred to me that there was really no better way than to provide the actual verbatim account of what was being experienced and felt in the moment. So there are a lot of emails in here, exchanges with my parents, with my siblings. So back to the email. Consequently, the past 48 hours have been a wrenching time of grieving for me. My mind has wandered to the end, skipping the all-important middle, which is living. During another restless and essentially sleepless night, it struck me suddenly and thankfully that I need, for my sake and especially Mom's, to change my perspective. I need to be thinking about life, not death. We've not lost her. She's with us, and God willing, she'll be with us for longer than any of us is imagining and fearing right now. A diagnosis of terminal cancer is perhaps especially terrible in that the end, which every one of us faces as an inevitable, is suddenly predictable, within sight. It's a known rather than an unknown. There's a time frame. Unfortunately, the sense of boundaryless living has been taken from Mom, but she is still living, and there could be joy in every remaining day if she and we carry on, as best we can, without thinking about the fact that we know the end is coming. I do not mean to suggest this will be easy, but I got out of bed this morning feeling as though I could possibly function today if I stopped my premature grieving. She is alive, and she does not want any of us, herself included, to be glum, as she put it. She's got more living to do before she dies. Yesterday I told Joe I could not imagine how I would be able to carry on in a manner that felt even remotely like as normal, but I realized this morning that I must, and I must do so in a way that feels and is authentic, not forced or fake. That means being fully in the moment. She needs to embrace life, and we do, for her and with her, for Dad and with Dad. We need to grill on their deck and celebrate Autumn Fields as such a great place for them to be. We need to play hearts. We need to recommend a good book. We need to share happy news of our children with her. And we need to consult her when we face challenges and need her shoulder. We need to make plans, not long-term plans necessarily, but plans that look beyond today and tomorrow. We need to do ordinary things because they are the things we would ordinarily do with her in our lives. We need to try to help her live before we inevitably find ourselves helping her die. And then I went on and on and on that subject. But the point was I had found my reason to live. And I had found a purpose, and I had found a way to cope. And I had found a strategy that actually resulted in the most extraordinary year for our family. It was filled with joy. It was filled with laughter. It was filled with love. And most of all, it was filled with life. And my mother called it a magical year, and it truly was. And even as we knew how the story was going to end, we felt we were still writing the chapters of her life and our lives, and that's how we addressed things. And we were so effective, in fact, that about 7 months after the diagnosis, my brother pulled me aside and said, "Linda, you should write a book, and you should call it Living While Dying." And at the moment, I appreciated but sort of dismissed his thought as being just an appreciative gesture from a brother who knew that I was really invested in this strategy. I lived closest to my parents. I was only a half hour away from them. I was spending a lot of time there. And he was grateful for that, as were my sisters. And so I dismissed the idea. I had no intention of writing a book. As I said, I write memos, not memoirs. But after my mother died, I believe that the seed my brother planted was watered by my tears, because as I would drive around, chapter headings would pop into my head. Or as I would lie awake at night, suddenly a paragraph was forming. And it kept happening, and my head kept filling. And I reached a point where I felt I needed a release for what was bubbling up inside me. And the words began to just flow as soon as I committed myself to writing. Rather than just feeling and processing, the words flowed right through my broken heart to my fingertips onto the keyboard. And as I said, within a very short period of time, less than 2 months, a substantial document had been produced. And it even made sense. And I certainly felt better. The interesting thing is I didn't want to be done writing, because I felt my mother was with me as I was writing. The closeness to her, and perhaps those of you who have written books know what I'm talking about here, she was so present with me. And in fact, my husband said that he thought maybe she was writing it with me. You know, he always encouraged her to write. She was a smart woman, a great writer, had good stories, and he even bought her a blank journal at one point to encourage her to write, and she never did. And I thought it was really a wonderful and loving thought that he had, that maybe this was her book, and that she was on my shoulder, in my heart, wherever she was, in whatever form, writing her book finally with me and through me. So that's how the book came to be. And although it was born of death, it's really a lot more about life and living. You know, as my brother suggested, I wrote it because we had lived, and we had lived fully and joyfully, even in the face of a terminal diagnosis. And so what I wrote about largely, and what these chapter headings suggested to me, were the tools that we employed, the tricks that we used, the strategies we used for injecting living into my mother's dying. It's not a straight chronology, although I do begin essentially with my father's phone call, and I take readers through to her dying, and then to the first 3 months of my being a motherless daughter. It's, as I said, more focused on the strategies, the tools, and the things we did to live. It's about her life and about living, not about death and dying. It's certainly not a how-to guide. So there are lots of things in the book. It's a love story. It's a story about my father and my mother, how they met, and the ways in which my father was transformed by this experience. In fact, one of my favorite chapters in the book is entitled No More Tears, and it's about him and how through this process a very stoic, stubborn, private German man learned how to cry. And that was another unexpected gift, because he was transformed in wonderful ways, in ways actually that I think reflect my mother's loving heart. She was really good at love. My father knew how to do it. We just didn't always experience it, because he did it in a very different sort of way. So it's a love story. It's a poetry lesson, as I said earlier. It's certainly a good mother-daughter story. It's a faith journey. Faith played a very important role in this experience for me. We can talk about that later if anybody has questions. And it's even about happy hour. Happy hour is a chapter in the book that I particularly like, and happy hour was one of our best tricks and tools of the year. And I'm going to share a little bit with you about it. And we've kept up happy hour even after my mom's death, for reasons that are sort of self-evident. So if you'll indulge me, I'm going to read another chapter, or a little bit of a chapter out of happy hour. Looking back on the year and a day following Mom's diagnosis and thinking about why this time was filled with so much happiness despite miserable circumstances and poor prognoses, one thing comes immediately to mind: happy hour. Happy hour became one of the signature events and defining experiences of Mom's magical last year. It became something akin to either religion or addiction. We practiced it faithfully, and we experienced withdrawal if we went too long without it. Happy hour, and sometimes just anticipation of happy hour, lifted our spirits when they needed lifting. And when didn't they need lifting? Happy hour could be plugged into any or every day if we felt like it. We needed happy hour. We didn't need it in the way an alcoholic needs his drink. We needed it because on the inside, none of us was happy. We were heartbroken because we knew Mom's days and thus happy hours were numbered. Happy hour came to be an oasis of joy in a desert of despair. Even on what were bad days for Mom, we could manage to have a happy hour or two, sitting around the living room fireplace or the patio table and just being together, talking, sharing, and always finding reason to laugh and feel happy, authentically so. We did not have to manufacture or fake happiness. Happy hour did not command happiness. It permitted happiness. Happiness just happened. I introduced happy hour very early in the year, as soon as I began spending days in Enfield with my mother while Dad worked at the hospital. I was distraught, not happy in those early days, but I had resolved to help Mom find joy in every day. This was my self-appointed mission. If there was joy in every day, I told myself, Mom would be motivated to muster whatever strength or will she needed in order to fight the good fight, believing she could have many more good days than predicted. This is what I wanted desperately, so I did what I could to make her days good days and her hours happy hours. With our first happy hour, wine, crackers, cheese, gas fire ablaze, piano concerto piped through the speaker system into the living room, Mom and I welcomed Dad home from work at the hospital. We asked him about his day and told him about ours. He was visibly thrilled to see Mom in such good spirits. In the days and weeks that followed, I believe he, more than anyone else, looked forward to happy hour. He would walk through the door from work and know it had been an okay day for his sweetie pie, if she was in good enough shape to be sitting in the wing chair next to the fireplace, or out on the deck waiting for him to join us and tell us about his day. Happy hour was something to look forward to later in a day that might not have started too well. It was something to do on days that for Mom were no longer filled with much activity or excitement. Mom could still do happy hour, even when she could not do much else. There were days when Mom did not get out of bed or dressed except for happy hour. On those days, I think she motivated herself for Dad's benefit largely, because she knew he used happy hour as a barometer to gauge how well she was doing, and she knew how much these moments of celebrating life meant to him. Eventually, we extended happy hour to days of the week when Dad was not working. We did not need his coming home from work as an excuse to uncork a bottle of wine and pull out the Triscuits and Cabot cheese. Dad started buying Triscuits in volume whenever they were on sale. He was delighted whenever Big Y promoted Cabot cheese with a special offer. Buy one, get two free. And he was tickled when Joe and I could get Jarlsberg for $3.99 a pound at Stu Leonard's. He asked Joe to pick out some good wines at our favorite wine shop in West Hartford, where we had always had good luck finding very nice wines in the $10 a bottle range. He wanted us to bring him a case so that he would always have a ready supply. Throughout the year, Joe would periodically be asked to restock the supply, always to be reimbursed by Dad, who was beginning to develop a fondness for a few of the finer Cabernets. But happy hour was not about the wine or the beer. We didn't drink much at all. Happy hour was about the act of setting aside a time of day to celebrate life and each other. We would celebrate with a bottle of beer or a glass of wine to accompany our cheese and crackers, and in so doing, make the hour more legitimately a happy hour in the traditional sense. If Eric was to be part of the gathering, Dad would stock up on beer and peanuts, Eric's idea of happy hour treats. Whenever Claudia was in town, happy hour's offerings looked rather different than the meager munchies I thought sufficed. Claudia, being the fabulous cook and hostess extraordinaire that I am not, served up far more elaborate and elegant hors d'oeuvres that added flair and flavor to the fun. Paula enjoys red wine as much as I do, and whenever we overlapped for a happy hour in Enfield, we invariably discovered one of us had walked off with and finished the other's glass of wine. These truly were fun times. Happy hour made our abnormal existence feel normal. So, and I've heard from people who've read the book and were traveling a similar journey that they've introduced happy hour and that it's been wonderful. And I can certainly assure you that the first happy hour or two after my mom's death were very difficult. But I felt it was really important for Dad and me particularly to carry on. So I would go to his house in Enfield on days when he was working. And it was fall, so they were short days and it was dark, so that he could come home to a house with the lights on. And the gas fireplace was ablaze, and I had the music on, and I had the Triscuits and the Cabot cheese and the wine, and we did it. We pushed through it, and we toasted her, and there were tears, but it got easier. It got easier, and we've included family members in happy hour, and we always include my mother, and it's just one other way to keep her present with us, and that's important. So I would like to, in honor of our happy hour and in celebration of my mother, share a bottle of Cabernet with somebody who's a lucky person tonight. And I'll point out that the label is very special to me. I didn't go looking for it. I guess it found me as I was looking for some Cabernets. And it's, if you can see it, birds flying, and tethered to the birds is a woman who's going up. And one of the birds is even highlighted in red. I cannot tell you how, I won't say I freaked out, but I was moved when I saw this, and I bought a case. And another one of my absolutely favorite chapters in the book, and it's certainly perhaps the most spiritual, is a chapter entitled The Birds. I had the most extraordinary and impossible to explain experience with birds after my mother died, after her celebration of life. And I won't give it away, but this could be a depiction of my mother or any loved one ascending to heaven. So I'd like to give this to somebody whose birthday is close to my mother's, and her birthday is October 24th. Anybody?
November 10th?
That's pretty darn close.
Yeah. October 14th.
Oh.
Oh.
He wasn't going to say anything.
Quick math, but I think you've got her beat.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that's just 10 days.
October 14th.
October 14th? Great. You know, I failed to mention my mother's name.
Yeah.
Nan. Nancy Saxa, my mother's name. So this is in honor of Nan. Think of her. And toast somebody that you love.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Enjoy. So, grief stinks, but I'm happy to report that I got through it and I emerged on the other side filled with gratitude. And that's the emotion that I feel far more profoundly than grief. The grief doesn't go away. It ebbs and flows. It takes different shapes. I didn't know how I would feel as I began to feel better, but what I felt was grateful. And maybe that's my mother's doing. She chose quotes for her memorial card, and one of them was a quote from Thornton Wilder, and it is, "The highest tribute to the dead is not grief, but gratitude." And so I'm reminded of that, and when I feel grateful, I think of her and her wishes. And among the things that I'm grateful for, believe it or not, are the really unexpected gifts associated with a terminal diagnosis. That may seem counterintuitive. How could that ever be a gift? And certainly when I got the news of it, it felt like anything but a gift. But what I came to realize as I lived through it and then as I reflected back on it is that it provided many unexpected opportunities. Among them, the opportunity to eulogize a loved one while she was still with me. I wrote her obituary while she was alive. And in fact, soon after she was diagnosed, as I think is typical, she and my dad went into, okay, we got to take care of business, check off the things on the list. And one of them was obituaries. And they had prepared obituaries, and when I was given hers to look at, I thought it was utterly unacceptable. Because, not that anyone asked my opinion, but it was skeletal. It wasn't her. It was an accounting, but it wasn't who she was. And so I rewrote the obituary, and I put the heart and the flesh on the bones. And in a way, that was a gift I was able to give to her. It was one of the most difficult moments I had during the year when I finally had to share it with her. I didn't want to because it seemed as though I was acknowledging the inevitable, and I knew it would be very difficult to have her read what I wrote, but it was, I think, the most intimate moment we shared, one of the most intimate moments. But in that moment, she knew how I felt. And throughout the year, she knew how her loved ones felt about her. And, we've all heard tell of, people who regret, or they walk out of a funeral thinking, gee, why didn't people tell her that while she was still alive? Or we've regretted it too. We've spoken in memorial services and perhaps driving home thought, gee, why didn't I tell him that's how I felt when he was still here to hear what I felt? So that was an unexpected and beautiful gift, the chance to really make sure that somebody knew how much she was loved while she was alive. The opportunity to give my mother a good death, as a friend put it. I was able to be part of birthing her into death the way she birthed me into life. When she was diagnosed, friends said to me, oh, it's going to be the most beautiful thing. And I thought, no, it's not going to be the most beautiful thing. This is the worst news I've ever experienced, and I'm going to go through the most painful, horrible, sad thing ever. But it was beautiful in ways that I couldn't imagine. So the chance to give someone a good death is a gift, and it's something to be grateful for. The chance to leave nothing unsaid, the chance to say goodbye was a gift. And the opportunity to look back and say, I have no regrets. That's a good thing. Perhaps it's of interest to you that 5 days before my mother, who was terminally ill for almost a year, died, we got a call from my husband Joe's mother letting him know that his father had had a massive stroke. And he was able to drive to the Cape, Labor Day Friday, and get there, Cape Cod Hospital, in time to join his mother and sister in the decision to take him off life support. So within the span of less than a week, we lost 2 parents. My 3 children lost 2 beloved grandparents. And we experienced 2 different kinds of death, which led to 2 different kinds of grief. My mother-in-law had a very different grief than my father had. She had not had a chance to say goodbye. There were things left unsaid. There were some regrets. Is either one better or worse? Is either one easier or more difficult? I don't know, because death and grief are difficult no matter how it's experienced. But from my perspective, I feel grateful that I was able to have that last year with my mother, as painful as it was, as excruciating as it can be to anticipate the end of a story. Another thing that I'm grateful for is to have been able to play the caregiver role without feeling that it was a burden. And I know that for many it is a burden. I was lucky that I am my own boss, so I didn't have to negotiate with, plead with a supervisor who didn't understand why I needed to spend time the way I was spending it. I was an empty nester. My youngest child went off to college that September that my mother was diagnosed. I didn't have young children who were pulling at my pant legs and demanding my attention all day long. That was lucky. I have a wonderful husband who was supportive of me and said, of course, go spend days away from home taking care of your parents. Go. You need to be there. I understand. And unfortunately, not all spouses are that understanding or as giving. So, I'm filled with gratitude for that, too. And I had siblings who were very supportive. I know from hospice and other sources that oftentimes families are at their most dysfunctional under stressful circumstances such as this. And we were so fortunate that we understood each other, we were patient with each other, we respected each other. Each one of us had slightly different ideas and approaches and emotional reactions, but somehow it worked, so I'm grateful for that too. And finally, what I'm grateful for is hospice. And I want to take just a few minutes before I throw it open for conversation and questions to talk about hospice. I'm particularly thankful to the hospice spiritual counselor who relieved my mother of the burden of thinking she was a burden to her family. And the last section that I want to share with you is about that. And then I'll talk more about hospice. One of the most important moments in our experience came when my mother was largely homebound and bedridden in the hospital bed set up in her living room. This moment was important because of the immediate and enduring relief it provided my mother. The relief did not come in the form of medicine or any treatment of her body. The relief came in the form of comfort for the soul, and it was administered not by a physician or family member, but by the spiritual counselor, aptly named Faith, who was a member of our hospice team. Faith didn't visit often, but what happened on her first visit secured her a spot in my heart and ensured she would be asked to return for future visits. In keeping with my commitment to focus on living as opposed to dying, I was reluctant to engage the hospice spiritual counselor, whose mission, as it had been explained to me, was largely to help a patient feel at peace about dying. Dying? But we're still living. Even as it was increasingly clear that my mother was getting closer to the end of her adventure with cancer, I continued to resist anything that might put a pall over her existence and remind her too suddenly or starkly how the story would end. Of course, we knew how it would end, but the story wasn't over yet. And I think I started in the wrong place. Let me just jump ahead. Excuse the non sequitur. But where I wanted to begin was here. You now know that Faith is at the house and visiting with my mother for the first time. Faith asked Mom how she was feeling or how she was doing. And in characteristic form, Mom did not focus on herself, but instead deflected the focus of attention away from herself and onto others. She admitted to feeling bad about the burden she felt she had become for her family. Faith quickly and masterfully disabused my mother of the notion, the painful misperception, that she was a burden to those who loved her. She acknowledged how difficult it must be for someone like Mom, who has been independent and in charge, someone who has been a nurturing, giving, loving mother and wife, to find herself out of control and in the position of needing to be cared for. She also deftly guided my mother to acknowledge how good it felt whenever she had had an opportunity to care for or help someone else over the course of her life. They agreed, giving feels good. Faith then opined that in spending time with Mom and caring for her, family members were doing something we wanted to do. We were choosing to be with her, to take care of her, to spend time away from our spouses and homes, to make it possible for her to stay at home herself. Faith further suggested, and I quickly affirmed, that we all felt good, not bad or burdened, because we were in a position to return some of the unending, unconditional love she had given to all of us throughout our lifetimes. Mom had guided and nursed her 4 children into life, and now, in a similar sort of form-altering transition, we would guide Mom into death, birthing her into whatever comes next. Though it was difficult for me to converse with Mom about her death in such a direct way, primarily because I feared it would be difficult or dispiriting for her, both she and I seemed to find comfort and purpose in Faith's life-affirming message. Then Faith told my mother something that completely changed the way she thought about her own situation and, in turn, ours. She said to Mom, "You have given them the gift of giving." Rather than being a burden to her family, Faith explained, the caring for her in her illness represented a gift to us, a gift from her. She was allowing us to help her, to give back, to love unconditionally. Viewing her plight through this prism made it possible, and more importantly made it logical and okay, to believe she was not a burden to her loved ones. In that aha moment with Faith, my mother's heart was no longer as heavy as it had been. I could see the relief in her face. The only one who had been feeling burdened was my mother. She had been suffering under the fear that she was, as she put it, causing such a commotion for all of us and disrupting our lives. In accepting that she was giving us a precious gift rather than extracting a heavy toll, my mother became unburdened. That unburdening in itself felt like a gift to us, one of the many reasons my family feels indebted to our hospice team. Mom knew then that although the prospect of losing her made us unspeakably sad, we were eternally grateful that her dying presented us the opportunity to wrap her tightly in our undying love. I cannot emphasize enough what a gift that was, because truly my mother's emotional suffering was worse than her physical suffering. And that's why hospice is so important. And for those of you who don't know it, hospice is a team approach, and it includes not only a nurse who works very closely with the primary care physician and is specially trained in end-of-life compassionate care, but also the spiritual counselor, also a social worker, also a bereavement counselor. And they all work as a team to help the patient's whole body, mind, spirit, emotions, and works with the whole family. They were available to us. There were times when I called and needed to speak with somebody just to see if I was doing the right thing, or I needed to just cry with somebody because I wanted to be strong in front of my mother and didn't want to cry in front of her. Hospice is an incredibly wonderful program that is woefully understood in this country and woefully underutilized. Too many people think it's something that it isn't. Too many people don't know what it is in the first place. Too many doctors are too reluctant to refer patients to hospice care soon enough because they feel that by acknowledging there's not a cure, somehow that's a failure on their part. The expression, "there's nothing more we can do," should be expunged from the medical lexicon, because there is something more that you can do. You can refer the patient to hospice care. And you can do so sooner rather than later, because hospice care is actually all about the philosophy that we adopted in my family. It's about living. It's about quality of life. When we were first referred to hospice, the nurse came to my house, or my dad's house, and met with him and me. And my mother had been in the hospital after having seizures that really signaled she had turned a corner to a more grave situation. And so during this intake interview, I proceeded essentially to lecture the nurse about our philosophy. We brought her home to live, not to die, and I went on and on and on, as a first daughter can do. And she listened and, made good eye contact and affirmed what I said. And then she put her hand on mine and she said, "Linda, that's what hospice is all about. It's about living. It's about quality of life." And maybe I should have known that. I didn't know that. But the hospice team made the unbearable bearable for my mother and for us. And thanks to the hospice team, she lived fully. She laughed and loved until the very end. And when the end came, she was with family. She died with dignity. She died without pain, and she died without regrets. And that's a wonderful thing. That's a wonderful thing. Unfortunately, I believe it is the exception rather than the norm in this country, for a number of reasons. And I think she experienced the kind of end-of-life care that everybody is entitled to. And one of the problems is that we don't talk enough about death in our society. It's a taboo. I think we're unique in that respect as Americans. We just don't talk about it. And there are several movements afoot to encourage more conversations, more timely conversations about death. Because the research shows the vast majority of us, 90% of us, want to be sure that we can give our loved ones a good death, that we want to be able to respect their wishes. And yet almost as many people, if asked, would say they don't know what those wishes are. And that's because there's not been conversation about end-of-life wishes. So one initiative that I'll just bring to your attention because I'm a huge fan is called the Conversation Project. And it was started a couple years ago by Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Ellen Goodman. And the goal of this organization is to encourage conversations about death and end-of-life wishes and compassionate care while there's time, to do so in a relaxed way. She's encouraging conversations at the kitchen table or in the living room rather than in the ambulance or the ER or the ICU when it may be too late. And through the telling of stories, others are being encouraged, the telling and the hearing of stories, others are being encouraged to have that conversation sooner rather than later. So you may want to check out the Conversation Project. And I certainly encourage you to think of hospice care as perhaps the most compassionate end-of-life care option that's available. If you follow the news, you know that for the past 2 years, a physician-assisted suicide bill has been presented in the Connecticut legislature and debated, and twice it didn't come out of committee. But the expectation is that it will be reintroduced this year, and it may stand a better chance of passing. I was asked to testify at the hearing in the previous 2 years, not because I wanted to advocate for or against physician-assisted suicide. I chose not to do that. What I chose to do was to advocate for hospice care and greater awareness about hospice as a compassionate end-of-life option that is patient-centered, patient-directed, and takes care of the whole person. So I told my story of hospice, and I've been spreading the hospice gospel, if you will, out of gratitude for the team, for the care that we received. As I said, too few people know what it is. Too many think it's something that it isn't, and too few are experiencing the kind of care that my family was fortunate enough to receive. So in closing, I just do want to say a little bit about my mother, Nan. In her last year, as one person told me, she was a warrior for hope and love. And I wrote that down because I thought it was such a wonderful way to describe my mother, a warrior for hope and love. But she was so much more than that. She radiated joy, she loved life, she was smart, as I said, she loved unconditionally and abundantly, and she died too young. She was 74, as I said a little bit earlier. And she really would be stunned to know how many people have been inspired by her example of grace and courage. And one of the other lessons that I've taken away from this relates to how we live life. And I do think that death teaches us a lot about life, and specifically how we should live life and what we might want our legacy to be. And my mother was always very impressed with my resume and very proud of the things that I had accomplished and that could be put on a resume. But as I reflected on her life and my life, it became very clear to me that I wanted an obituary like hers. I wanted to be remembered the way that she will be remembered, for the way she loved, for the way people loved her. Her legacy is a legacy of love. What I realized was that while she wanted to be more like me, I wanted desperately to be more like her. And I have tried so hard since her death to live and love the way she did, so that I stand a chance, perhaps, of being remembered in the way that she was, for the good person she was, with the big heart. So to close, I'm going to read a poem from the book that is actually the source of the title. You may remember at the beginning of my talk I said my brother had suggested I write a book and call it Living While Dying. And in fact, when I finished the manuscript, I used essentially that title, although I added a few words. It was a year of living, a year and a day of living while dying. That was the name of my manuscript. And if time permits, and you want to ask the question because I know you're writing the book, I'll tell you how I changed it and why I changed the title to When All That's Left of Me Is Love. So I'd like to read one poem, and then we'll wrap it up. And this is an anonymous poem, so I cannot give credit to its source. When I die, if you need to weep, cry for your brother or sister walking the street beside you. And when you need me, put your arms around anyone and give them what you need to give me. I want to leave you something better than words or sounds. Look for me in the people I've known or loved, and if you cannot give me away, at least let me live in your eyes and not on your mind. You can love me most by letting hands touch hands, by letting bodies touch bodies, and by letting go of children that need to be free. Love doesn't die, people do. So when all that's left of me is love, give me away. So all that's left of my mother now is her love, the love that we shared. And I believe that the undying love of those that we lose continues to live in us and through us. And that she is still loving me through my loving of others. And I'm sharing her with others when I share my love. So I found great inspiration in that poem, not just for the title of my book, but for the way that I live. And her love lives. She lives in my heart. So thank you for listening to my story, a little bit of it, in whatever time remains, and I have no clue because they didn't tell me when to wrap up. It's 1:15, so I can stay as long as anybody wants to, but I'd love to get comments or questions.